Yes, we'll start with our workshop on science communication in times of the COVID-19 pandemic, news media, social media, and the role of misinformation. Let me quickly present our guests. First of all, thanks to you all for participating and being able and willing to take on the work to prepare for this. I'll start with Thorsten Quandt. He is professor of online communication at the University of Münster. Research operates at the intersection of communication studies, psychology, and data science. Second, Mark Eisenegger. He is full professor and co-director of the Department of Communication and Media Research at the University of Zurich, and also the director of Research Center for the Public Sphere in Society, which publishes a major annual study on the development of media quality in Switzerland and abroad. Nguyen is a professor of journalism and head of the Science, Health and Data Communication Research Group at Bournemouth University in the UK. His research expertise includes science, journalism, quantitative journalism, especially focusing on the use and misuse of data and statistics in the news. Then we have Dominique Brossard. She is professor and chair in the Department of Life Science Communication at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research agenda focuses on the intersection between science, media, and policy, with focus on public opinion dynamics related to controversial scientific issues. And finally, Dietjam Schäufele is the Taylor Bascom Chair in Science Communication and Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and in the Morgridge Institute for Research. His work examines the social effects of emerging science and technology. He currently co-chairs the National Academy of Sciences in Engineering and Medicine. Herewith, I call on Thorsten Quandt to begin with his presentation.
Thank you very much also for the kind introduction, Professor Weingart. And thank you again. I'm honored to be here today with you. And I'm really happy to present our work on pandemic waves and information flows. In the next 15 minutes, I try to give you some insight on the findings from a longitudinal content analysis of German mainstream and alternative news media. And I'm really happy that I got the first slot because I planned this as a kind of an overview of what happened in the pandemic and what we read in the media and in alternative news media. Before I do that, before I delve deeper into the study, I want to travel back in time with you to the beginning of the pandemic and see how it all started. I know that it feels like eternity now, but it's just 2 years actually. And sometimes people do not even remember, the beginning and what's happened in these first 2 or 3 months of the pandemic. And that's actually crucial for our research because we decided very quickly and early on in the pandemic to do some research on that. So just as a reminder, as a starting point, how this all started wasn't in Germany, it was in China, as you all remember. We all witnessed that. The Wuhan food market, there was the first outbreak there. And that is serious, we realized very quickly by seeing the pictures that came from China, when they completely shut down a city, when they kind of were building hospitals from scratch, and we got all these apocalyptic pictures from China. But back then people thought, okay, that's quite far away. But it wasn't that far away because actually in less than a month it traveled to Germany. The first case was the Webasto cluster, where a Chinese co-worker was bringing the infection to that company. And the first bigger outbreak was at the end of February, just less than 2 months after the beginning in China. That was the Gangot case. That was a kind of a first super spreading event at a carnival party. So that also brought us the first death. And it was just a few days, actually. On the 9th of March, we had the first death from that event, and that actually made it very clear that this is a serious thing. And it became kind of a public thing and a control thing for a state and the government with the Ischgl cases. That was also at the beginning of March, when there was another super spreading event. I heard crazy numbers that actually 10,000 or even more cases go back to this event in Ischgl, where they were partying after skiing at après-ski parties. And this totally spun out of control. And probably you all remember the pictures of people trying to escape the area, traveling back to Germany in their cars, in trains, which contributed further to the spreading of the virus. And that led to a situation that the government kind of intervened. So Angela Merkel had her public address just a couple of days later, where she said that they will impose a lockdown on the country. And with social distancing measures, something that was completely strange to us back then. Nowadays, it's the new normal, actually. And why I try to repeat this, or why I want to bring that back to your memory, is that we very early on in that phase, we started to do research on that, because we felt there is no information on that in the public. There was a lot of talk, a lot of confusion, but there was no scientific evidence on what is happening in the media and alternative media and what is discussed there. So I actually tracked it back. My first email on that project was on the 6th of March. And the first publication was a preprint, actually. And maybe we will discuss that later on, the question of preprints in that phase. That was done in a month, which is very uncommon in science. So we published that via archive on the 6th of April. And that will become important later on maybe as well. So what did we do in these studies? As I said, it's kind of an ongoing research project because it started back then, but it's still something that we're doing research on. So the simple question we asked back then was, what is happening in news outlets and what is happening in alternative news media? Because we felt that alternative media and other channels on the internet had a totally different story than the rest of the coverage. And so we basically did research on the reach and the interaction of news items, on the topical structure, how news changed over time, what emerged there, what actors showed up there, in what context, and how were the sentiments, so was it positive or negative? And we also tried to identify fake news, which are kind of fully fabricated news items, and also conspiracy theories that we defined as unverified rumors or assumptions or speculations. Because there was, also the idea that there's a lot of fake news circulating out there. And we probably all remember a few of these items that we also got via WhatsApp or social media. How did we do that? We analyzed these mainstream and alternative news media via CrowdTangle, via Facebook. Actually, people falsely said it's a Facebook study. It's not. It's actually not. We're not interested in Facebook. Facebook was just a tool for us to actually get to the news. So we used CrowdTangle to kind of collect all the news items in the German language area, and especially coming from German media. And we started that data collection actually in 2020, directly after the virus spread. So what I present you today is the 1-year data, which is basically 844,000 news posts from 100 media. The bigger part of it is from the mainstream media sites, and most of it was done with computational content analysis. But we also did some qualitative detail analysis. All of this, and I think that's also important because it refers to a lot of other work out there as well. All of this was done with a very small core team with no external funding. So back then, nobody had money for this or thought about it. So it was really an initiative where we thought the public actually needs that information to have some kind of impartial look at what is happening in society. So what did we find there? In the mainstream news media, we found a picture like this. So what you see here is the news flow over time, that blue graph. And you can see that the overall output of news during the pandemic remained pretty stable. So the light blue thing is pretty stable. You see these little dents, these are the weekends. On the weekends, you get less news. And you can see overall the level of coverage was the same. But what you can see is that the dark part, that is basically the COVID-related post, that was growing like crazy during the first lockdown. So in March, April, and May, it was really the dominating topic. There was next to nothing else there, maybe just the weather forecast, but that was basically it. So everything was COVID back then. But what you can also see here is that it was kind of normalizing. It's still a very important topic, but it's not that the majority of news items is dominated now with COVID. You have other news items that have nothing to do with that. Then we actually looked further and tried to identify topics in there. And I just want to focus on this here, the composition of the news. And what we found here is that a lot of it was incident rates, challenges to society, the crisis management of the government, societal debates, and how it affected, for example, cultural life and work. So basically the mainstream news media made it a social phenomenon. And we found a kind of a pattern here. So this is the same news flow divided by these topics. And the pattern basically was that there was a beginning where you had core news, where the contextual information was added to it. Then news media started to give background, and then there was a broadening to a kind of a societal perspective. And by doing so, they started, with a kind of a crisis mode, where it was just numbers and facts, and then they were broadening it and basically made it a domestic topic, kind of a German topic, and normalized it and referred it to the country. And with new events like second wave and numbers going up again, they turned again to that crisis mode before going back to normalization. That is something that journalism does always with crisis, that they try to work on it with their routines. That's what we've seen in the traditional media. Now, what's more interesting is probably what we found in the alternative news media. And I just want to give you a brief look into that. So with the alternatives, that's basically, independent journalists, former mainstream journalists like Tichy, or personal blogs, or even state-controlled media that we had there. And what we found there is a different composition. So what we found is same coverage of the infection numbers. It was a very big topic in the beginning, also the economic consequences. That looks like in the mainstream media. What we also had is something on the crisis management, but with a twist. I will come back to that in a second, because we had that in the mainstream as well. But then we had very different topics like the criticism of protection measures and also distrust of the government. And I just want to zoom into these three very, very quickly. So again, this is the news flow, looks very similar, and economic consequences and infection numbers, that's also something we found in the mainstream. But the other three are very different. So when I say crisis management with a twist, this was not about, the crisis management that works in Germany, but it was basically shortcomings of what is happening in Germany or Austria and the German countries, a very negative view, and also the fear of COVID that is actually kind of related to infectious migrants. That was in the beginning very strong there. Also, it was basically praising the crisis management of other countries that do it better, like Russia. Also, what we found here is, as I said, the criticism of protection measures. So there was a lot of coverage here on the refusal of masks. That was very positive. So they said, yeah, maybe masks are not a good idea. They trivialized COVID, and the anti-vaccination movement was already present from the beginning of May 2020. So that is something I really want to point out, because I said, it's important that we started early. We could see what is happening in the country already at the beginning of 2020. That is nothing that was, happening in the summer or later, but it was really already in spring that we could see it in the discussions there in alternative media. Same is true for conspiracy narratives, although we have to say that conspiracy or fake news are not a big part of it. It's more about a negative portrayal of the society per se. So we had a fear of government surveillance, also a negative discussion of the cancel culture and how that relates to COVID, and a very positive way of talking about the street protests against corona protection measures. And there we also had these kind of outbreaks of the coverage there. So as I only have 15 minutes, I come to an end. and just a few take-home messages from that. So what can we see here? Basically, what we can see is that the mainstream basically was following a specific time-based pattern of crisis reaction that led to a normalization of COVID-19, which is very typical for traditional journalism. And we found kind of recurring event-based reinitializations of the crisis mode. For the alternative media, we found a very different narrative of the crisis. Negativity, distrust in mainstream voices, anti-state and anti-government pieces, and also anti-establishment pieces, which includes institutionalist science. So science is basically part of what they criticize because it's part of the institution. Again, that was visible very, very early on in the pandemic. Fake news and conspiracy theories, we didn't find that much. The issue that we found is really the construction of this parallel alternate reality. And indeed, it's referring to the same events that are there, but it's kind of an anti-reality because it's very different from what we find in the mainstream media. And again, anti-vaxxers were already present in May 2020, and also the conspiracy theories. So this is really nothing new. We already have seen that before last year. So it's nothing that happened in the last few months or was just building up slowly. And so it was for us surprising that politicians and others were so surprised about this happening because you could already see it back then. How did the media react to it? Well, a lot of media covered that. So the traditional mainstream media did their journalistic thing, covered our research, also on a worldwide basis. What happened from the side of the alternative media, and that is also kind of a very good descriptor of what they're doing. We got reactions like this from alternative media and their supporters. I got a lot of emails, also death threats. So people said there are no death by corona. This is all something you're making up. I'm angry about your research. It's a waste of taxpayers' money. They wanted to find out whether kind of a conspiracy is behind it, that I'm paid by Bill Gates, or that I should stop the delusion of the public. And also some people threatened me that on day X, people like me will be kind of apologize for that and what else comes with it. That was very interesting because, as I said before, it's a computer-based analysis. So it's not much that we added to that, but still people weren't really happy about us reporting on that. If you want to read more about it, as I said before, it's published as white papers, but there are also proper publications now. And I was glad to present that very briefly in these 15 minutes. And I'm looking forward to this discussion. Thank you.
We go on with Mark Eisenegger.
Thank you, Professor Weingart. So I will start sharing my screen. So thank you again for inviting me to this workshop. It's a big honor to be here to discuss these interesting topics with you together. One of my main research interests relates to the question of changing media quality in digitalized society. And this is actually what I want to mainly talk about today. So I have structured my presentation as follows. First, I will give you a brief insight into our yearbook Quality of the Media project in Switzerland, which I will mainly refer to today. Second, after that, I will present findings on the importance and quality of science reporting in Switzerland. Third, I will present results on the quality of corona reporting. And then finally, I will conclude with some findings on the problem of disinformation in Switzerland. So empirically, as I said, I will draw primarily on research findings from the yearbook Quality of the Media. In this project, we evaluate the quality of news media outlets with the widest reach in Switzerland on an empirical basis. We are also able to make statements about reporting quality in specific subject areas, including science reporting, for example. Our quality rating is based on 3 quality dimensions. We assess the relevance, for example, diversity, and also so-called deliberation quality of news reporting. In addition to our main study, we regularly publish studies on specific topics. Today, I will refer to 3 studies in particular: studies on the quality of corona reporting, on disinformation, and on science reporting in Switzerland. So before discussing the empirical results, I would like to give you some background information on the Swiss case, where perhaps you are not that much familiar with this country. First, a few characteristics of the Swiss media system. The Swiss media system shows many similarities with other democratic corporatist media systems, such as the German or Scandinavian media systems. Characteristic for this type of media systems is a strong position of public service media and of subscription newspapers, for example, but also the strong position of online news sites. Empirical studies show a high level of trust in established journalistic news media in Switzerland. But there is also a marked increase in media concentration in Switzerland, and this is mainly driven by the growing market power of the global tech platform. And of course, this is something which is not specific to Switzerland, something we can observe in many Western countries. With regard to science, the population shows a high degree of trust in science, especially during the corona pandemic. Swiss citizens express high trust in science, as shown, for example, by the Swiss Science Barometer. So I would like to start the part on empirical findings now, with results on the quality of journalistic science reporting. When we ask the question about the importance and quality of journalistic science reporting, we must first answer the question of whether journalistic science reporting is an important source of information for users to learn about scientific topics. And this question can be answered with the Swiss Science Barometer, a large ongoing study actually led by my colleague, Mike Schäfer, I guess he's also here in this round. And it's a study on the perception of science in Switzerland. The study shows that scientific topics reach the population most commonly via the internet, including journalistic online media, but also newspapers, news magazines, and TV broadcasts, for example, play a major role as sources of information on science. So journalistic news media does remain an important source of on science. However, science as a topic plays only a marginal role in reporting, as this chart here shows. Only 2% of all articles in the Swiss news media focus primarily on scientific topics. This shows that the revenue crisis in journalism is having a major impact on science reporting. Here, the findings of other international studies are confirmed. The revenue crisis in journalism has a particularly negative impact on science reporting. So in many editorial departments, science reporting is being cut back as a result of financial losses. From a quality perspective, science reporting has, of course, the important task of explaining and contextualizing social issues from a scientific perspective. However, our research shows that the contextualizing and the explanatory nature of science reporting is declining. Science reporting is increasingly episodic in nature, i.e., scientific events are contextualized only in small and declining proportions. On the positive side is that the share of explanatory reports has increased slightly since the outbreak of the pandemic. According to our study, journalistic reports that weigh and critically contrast different study results are also the exception. Similarly, there's little information in journalistic reports about how reliable or unreliable the results of scientific studies being reported are. This corresponds with the results of a recently published study on the quality of corona reporting in Germany. The uncertainty of scientific forecasts is often not conveyed in journalistic science reporting. Moving on to the third part of my presentation, I would now like to present findings on the quality of Swiss corona reporting. Again, I want to start with the question of how important journalism is as a source for users to learn about the pandemic. Our population survey shows that the authorities are the most important sources of information on the pandemic. This is also evidence of the still relatively high level of trust in authorities in Switzerland. As can be seen from the graph below, journalistic media are also very important as sources of information. Public service media are particularly important sources, as are newspapers and news magazines. Social media, which is also interesting, are rated as less important by Swiss users. This correlates with users perceiving social media as less trustworthy. So the Swiss population perceives information sources from the authorities and established journalism as the most important sources of information in the pandemic. Exactly the same sources are most influential in social media, especially in the Swiss Twitter sphere. That's what this network graph here shows. Using automated content analysis, we examined which actors communicating about the pandemic in the Swiss Twitter sphere triggered the most follow-up communication. We can see that in the Twitter sphere, two authorities and established journalistic media are the most influential communicators. Crises are thus characterized by established communicators gaining in importance as sources of information also on social media. Journalism was and is an important source of information on the pandemic, but what is the quality actually of media coverage of the pandemic? If we first look at the volume of reporting on the pandemic, and this goes back to what Thorsten Quandt already showed us, is that we see an extreme concentration of attention on the issue at the first phase of the corona reporting. Our automated analysis of all topics covered by important Swiss news media shows that at the peak, 70% of all media articles refer to the topic COVID-19. And this concentration of attention is accompanied by significant displacement effect. It can be shown that the volume of reporting on the problem of climate change, for example, in the news media, has decreased by 46% since the outbreak of the pandemic, and by as much as 55% in the Twitter sphere. So corona reporting is thus accompanied by significant losses of diversity on a macro level. In the next step, we also examined the diversity of corona's coverage. Here, we were interested in the question of how diverse the scientific disciplines are that receive attention in the corona discourse. The graph here shows that the scientific disciplines are very unevenly distributed in the corona reporting. Clearly dominant are medical disciplines in the broader sense, i.e. including epidemiology and virology. In contrast, scientists from economics, for example, but also from social sciences receive very little attention. Thus, the reporting focuses heavily on those scientists with expertise, which lies mainly in combating the virus. This is striking, I think, in that the corona crisis has social consequences, of course, far beyond the medical virological aspects. So I come to the final part of my presentation and want to conclude with some findings on the problem of disinformation in Switzerland. For a long time, disinformation was not considered to be a major problem in Switzerland. Our survey on the problem of disinformation now shows that the situation clearly changed during the pandemic. From a methodological point of view, it must be said that such a survey measures the perception of whether disinformation is present and not the actual spread of disinformation. Nonetheless, it appears that half of all Swiss people now consider the problem of disinformation to be a major or even a very major problem since the outbreak of the pandemic. Also, around a quarter of Swiss people say that they frequently or very frequently come into contact with disinformation. The question, of course, arises now as to how big the problem of disinformation is beyond perceptions. One way to measure this is to look at the extent to which disinformation is further disseminated on social media. We investigated this by examining the spread of concrete disinformation in the Swiss Twitter sphere based on a network analysis. Depicted here below are two network graphs of all Twitter accounts that tweeted about COVID-19 in the Swiss Twitter sphere. Shaded in blue are those Twitter accounts that have tweeted or retweeted disinformative tweets. The left network graph refers to the disinformation that COVID-19 was intentionally developed as a biological weapon. The right, a green network graph, refers to the disinformation that 5G antennas would promote the spread of the coronavirus. Our analysis shows that only few users retweeted the disinformation, and if they did, it was mainly in a critical or joking form. So although the Swiss population considers disinformation to be a major problem, resilience in Switzerland appears to be relatively high. Disinformative content is disseminated only with restraint. Here it becomes clear that the virulence of the problem of disinformation depends also on structural factors at the macro level. One can assume that the comparatively low level of polarization, for example, but also the comparatively high level of trust in science results in relatively high resilience to disinformation. So let me draw a brief conclusion. Although journalism remains an important source of information on scientific topics, our research shows that the share of science reporting is marginal. Journalistic science reporting also has quality deficiencies. It is often episodic and lacks contextualization. Uncertainty in the context of scientific results and forecasts is rarely conveyed. Scientific disciplines are also very unequally represented in the COVID-19 reporting. And finally, it is apparent that disinformation is a growing problem in the public's perception. Despite this growing concern, resilience to disinformation remains high. The relatively high level of trust in science, along with other macro structural factors, explains the high level of resilience to disinformation in Switzerland. So that's it for the moment from my side. Thank you very much for your attention, and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was also very informative, and thank you also for keeping time. Next one is Nguyen, who will take on journalism and its treatment of statistics.
Okay, thank you very much for having me here. An honor to be here. Yep. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit of some of the. This is an ongoing project that I'm working at the moment, and the present today is mainly based on where we are now. You know, it's still not a conclusive set of evidence or whatever, but we started this with a conference, a one-day conference with about 20 science and health journalists in the UK and statisticians in the UK last year, about a year ago, to look at the first year of COVID-19 data and statistics in the news. And since then, I carry on with interviewing and then doing in the middle, doing the content analysis. But so what I'm going to do is to talk a little bit about what are the key lessons that have already been, discussed in the context of COVID-19 data and statistics in the news. So, but just a context of this year, everybody probably would know that we live in a data-driven world where statistics is now part of the fabric of our life. Everything is measured. Everything is if it's not measured, it's not taken for granted or for seriously at all. So and it's become more increasingly so in the data-fied world. So but together with that is this very disturbing trend of statistics being used and abused by all sorts of vested interests to manipulate people's hope and fears by very powerful institutions, and there is also this recent rise with what Tim Harford calls statistical bullshit, which is basically the casual slinging around numbers, not because it's true or false or whatever. They don't care. What they care is to stir emotion and to sell a message, to stir emotion and anger. And this very obvious in the case of Brexit, and also the Trump use of very manipulative use of data. So, and the COVID-19 coming to that context, it's like a new culminating point of this whole chaos, because from day one, everything we do, and even now, still depends on what the data, what the numbers tell us. But at the same time, there is a whole, of chaos around numbers that present a lot of challenges to journalists, and of course to the public. And I will go into some of the challenges. Sorry. So the first and very, very immediate challenge is there is a huge discrepancy between the public thirst for answers, and there was no answer at all in the beginning. It's an extreme disequilibrium in information at the time, and it was a huge source of pressure for the journalists, because they want answer and there were no answers. So there was a lot of uncertainties and all those things. And amidst that sort of uncertainties, we have a whole influx of concepts, new concepts, statistical concepts, and with a lot of not all of them are unified, or a lot of them are with a lot of competing measures. The R number, for example, I think about a year ago there were about 7 groups, measured in different, ways. They are having different ways of 8 groups measuring R number in different ways in the UK. So, or even death. What is death? Is it what is a death from COVID? Can we tell, whether there is a death from COVID or, death within 20 days of contracting COVID? So all of the concepts and all of the measures were very, chaotic, because there was no unified measurements and everybody were competing. And then of course we have this problem of preprints. I mean, a lot of the preprints were really of very high quality, but many of them are basically because they are not yet, so a lot of them are deeply flawed. I know that we will discuss that sometime later on in this workshop, I think. And there is also the rise of armchair epidemiologists, whose scientists became the sort of experts with no evidence. We advise people, we go on TV, go on TV and talk, but there was no evidence at all, and that gave the public the impression of science was becoming kind of an opinionated debate. And then there is this problem with political communication of data, very poor, either poor communication or manipulative communication of statistics by politicians, especially number 10. Press briefings in the early days was David Spiegelhalter called it number theater, and Kevin McConway, I think Kevin is here today in the audience, I think, called it a charge cinema. And you know, there are a lot of data being thrown out into the public at the press conference without any kind of care for truthfulness or reliability or validity. It's just to stir angers or fears or whatever to influence people's behavior. And then the other challenge, there are very difficult access to the data was already rare, but there was also the problem with accessing data, existing data, because even now some of the NHS Trust even prevent their members from providing data to journalists. And then there is also the problem of access to those who have some expertise, either because they were too busy or that either because they were just basically didn't really want to be part of that initially because of the risk of being politicized. And then, of course, there is also this issue, especially in the initial stage where, okay, should we cover it as a political story or should we cover it as a science story? So there was some competing interest between different news bits in the newsroom, and very often, newsroom in the initial stage, they send very wrong reporter to not science journalists, but political journalists, for example, to press briefings and that sort of thing. And of course, on the backdrop of that is there is this very, very long established troubling relationship with numbers, with journalism, relationship with numbers. And I think so there is this cultural kind of antagonism to numbers among journalists. There is a lack of, well-documented lack of numerical competencies among journalists, especially naive empiricism and all. And there is also the tendency for journalists to force this data into kind of shoehorn data into their own kind of or existing conception and prejudices. And all of this were exacerbated before the pandemic, especially with the slacks of science and even data news journalism teams. Data journalism, after a few years took up in the early 20noughties, then it became kind of, the high went off a little bit, and then newsroom started to slash a lot of the teams. Generally very good. I mean, there are a lot of mistakes, of course, but there has been a lot of, positive, movement efforts, and because during the Thorsten and Mark were talking about, during the pandemic, it's still the mainstream media is still, the main source of whatever people want to know about the pandemic, and these data to help them to understand it was the media that was doing the job mainly. And so there has been a lot of positive appreciation of that. And there is also this rise of, I think, an increasing rise of, what the data journalists as data scientists, a lot, some of the news organizations like the Economist or the Financial Times or the Guardian, they do a lot of, they turn themselves in the face of, lacking data, whatever, and in the early days. So this was the one example from the Economist where they use, collect the first news organization that built up an international news tracker using access data to work out, to tell, exactly what were the, to estimate the death rate from COVID-19, rather at a time when data was still missing. There were not much data, and they did that, in a very, I mean, it's very complicated in the methodology and that sort of thing. But I think this one example that you might want to look on their website. So what are the lessons? I think there are two areas I want to talk about. One is, one thing is there was, some of the journalists we interview and talk to have been, the first thing to be very sophisticated with data. Number do not speak for themselves. This is still a mistake that has been made in some of the news organizations anyway. Like the daily count data, for example, daily death count or daily cases. They are not really data. People who have contracted in the past 24 hours, as it's been sometimes reported now, it was the data that, recorded at the time the data were announced, which could be a few days back, or and it's never completed. And the second thing is, when in this sort of situation, the advice from some of the journalists to prepare for the battle, you need to fight very well. Journalists need to fight very well, especially with press officers from the government, and also from medical organizations. And one thing to deal with the data, to deal with the lack of data, is to gather data from all possible sources where you can. The economists, they gather data of even, not excess the numbers, but also the data about number of burials during the early days, just to estimate the true estimate the true scale of death from COVID-19. One of the things that also emerged in our talk with journalists is actually the role of intermediaries like the Science Media Center. I've been very skeptical about, this SMC model, but, it was, what has come up is the Science Media Center in the UK, for example, done a very good job in connecting statisticians and journalists together in those very, very hot days, even now, and it came up at a very helpful way, the hand for journalists during until now. There's also this issue of, advice from journalists is to treat scientists as scientists. A lot of initial mistakes were to get people with no real expertise to talk about things that they don't know. Or there was also the attempt by some journalists to force journalists, to drive journalists into taking a position, to take sides. But those journalists that we interview, those people that we interview, make it very clear that shouldn't happen, and that is how their science journalism and data journalism, thrive very well and fare very well during the pandemic. And there was also, the initial, ignorance of people, the health professionals who work on the ground, like nurses or people who healthcare workers on the ground in hospitals and in community, and that was one of the key things that make some of the news organizations very successful in COVID-19 data and statistics. There is also the call for to collaborate between newsrooms, to share data and to work together to come up with a sort of standardization in some measurements to compare, to report among news organizations. And also above all, they said, keep a cool head, whatever the pressure is, it's the same old principles of journalistic verification. Actually, that the count, and that make you stand out, that journalists stand out. In terms of communicating data, there are things that, always, of course, we need to put the numbers in context, which is, what is the death rate? What does it mean? For example, how do we calculate it? And there are also a lot of attempts to integrate, putting the audience in the center of the data flow, using like geocoding or localization and all those things. There have been identified quite a lot of techniques using to humanize the data, to avoid what they call the psychic numbing, which is statistical boredom, or statistical panic, which is panic out of proportion. And there was a call, very important, is to be transparent about their methods. Make your data, make their data. The economists, again, for example, they put all their data, access that data on GitHub for people to use, and it's been cited by hundreds of academic studies, not just by newsroom, used by other newsroom, but it's been cited by hundreds of other, academic studies even. And most importantly, not less importantly, it's very important to acknowledge uncertainties, be humble about your own method, their own methods, and to tell people that this is not completely certain. And research has shown that communicating authenticity actually doesn't really reduce public trust in science. It actually increases public trust in science if you do it well. So I think one of the long-term legacy of COVID-19 is basically, it's not really the stereotype of journalists as, number phobic or whatever, incompetent number. It's not always, it doesn't hold in many cases, especially in these cases. And what makes these journalists and these data journalism initiative very successful and very authentic is because they are provided, they are adequately invested to do so. There is a strong commitment by the newsroom to do it. Economics, for example, they had data, a team of about 17, 18 people when when the pandemic started, for example. So it's, I think, and with the pandemic now, there is, I hope that there is a new appetite for data and statistics in the public and also among the newsroom, a new recognition that, journalists need to be statistically competent because you cannot ignore it. As journalists, do in that, traditionally. And for us as journalism scholars, for example, this again, we have to integrate put it into our curriculum and push it ahead rather than creating the impression among our students that, you journalists are not good at math. Actually, statistics is not math, but this is the impression that this is C.C. Wei, who is the executive director of Open News, who talk about, what journalists should, what journalism educators should do to their journalism students. I stop it there, and thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Nguyen. It's interesting that at a time and with a crisis that is so dependent on data, that you have to remind journalists to be data-wise and pay attention especially to the use of data. So let me ask you, or ask around, is there any question from our working group members that you want to raise? I have a question in the F&A that's by Mohammed Shamir. What are the measures taken by respective governments to control disinformation on COVID-19? And Ditram gives an answer. Ditram, you do that? You
just typing. I'm not.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Then okay. Let's start with Mike Schaefer.
Yes. Thank you very much for these presentations. Very interesting and very impressive. I have a question that connects to one of the questions we had in the F&A to Torsten Quandt about the alternative media. And you kind of presented the big picture very interestingly, also the comparison between news media and alternative media. And I was thinking, partly also, I didn't have the chance to actually look at the list of alternative media that you have in there. But if you can say something about different kinds of alternative media, namely alternative media representing different milieus. What I was thinking of were these recent studies by Oliver Nachtwey, a sociologist from Basel, who has described for Germany that you have two basic milieus that he has said that inspire or that are the foundations for a lot of vaccination protests and skepticism in Germany, which is on the one hand, this rather populist, more on the political spectrum on the right hand side, general skepticism towards elites, towards quote unquote the system and the media, by extension then also the pharma industry, etc. And you certainly have that in there in your alternative media. The other milieu that he is describing is a milieu that has traditionally also and always been skeptical of vaccination, predating COVID, which is the more alternative, quote unquote, esoteric, anthroposophic, more left-oriented milieu that you have in the stronger, he says, for example, in Western Germany, in Baden-Württemberg, etc. So I was wondering, do you have this division also in the alternative media? Is it represented there? And do you see differences in how they look at the issue?
Yeah, Quint, you want to reply?
Sorry, I was talking, but I forgot to switch on the mic. Yeah, thank you for the question. Actually, that's a really good question, because it's always, a difficulty here when you do this type of research, what goes into the definition and what you measure there. Is this really the alternative news media? So I'm not naive in the sense of, that this is the one truthful representation of what is in there. So if you look at the sub kind of composition of what we have in alternative media, it's also varied, as you said. So we have these populist right-wing media, and we also have this anti-vaxxer esoteric movement there. Although I would say that for these two groups, there's kind of overlap now. It's not that they're really that, divided. And that is an analysis we also wanted to do. We couldn't do it because of time restrictions, but how this has changed over time and how it kind of overlaps more and more, because you can really see that there's this kind of co-orientation that they have, and people are using the one and the other, and they're also referring to each other. So it's really like, as I said before, it's kind of a separate reality happening there, where the same people that you see on the streets, with the Querdenk movement, where you also have this very strange combination. You could see that before also in that kind of milieu or context that we measured there. There's also another group there, which is externals. So Russia Today, for example, that's a very big actor. And we actually thought about taking that out and analyzing them separately because they are so influential. So definitely we have to be open, about that. This is not a uniform thing, but still it's kind of an interconnected network. So I think that is the short answer I can give to you. The longer answer is that I think we would have had to have a look at all the individual media, and there's so many of them that it's always a bit difficult to lump them together in the kind of a combined category, as it's always the case with social scientists' work.
Okay, thank you. Otwin, Len.
Yeah, thank you very much. First, I would like to thank all the speakers. Very interesting talks. I would like to explore again, the last talk was about statistics. And I think what I would like to see a little bit more explained, maybe by all speakers, what is the role of statistical, specifically stochastic information in the media? We have seen that a lot of recipients of statistical information have a hard time understanding what these numbers mean. And also they feel that they're inconsistent, or that why suddenly more people that are vaccinated in hospitals, although their probability of being affected is much lower. So you get all these kind of questions in there, which also may have an impact on the credibility of the sources. Is there any research results there that you would say that gives maybe some better information on how this kind of statistical information is processed, either by the media or even by the recipients?
Who's supposed to answer?
Yeah, I can respond to that a little bit. So I think beyond the pandemic, but outside the pandemic, there has been quite a bit of research about the impact of statistics on public opinion, data statistics in the news on public opinion, and the evidence is still very, very mixed. And one thing that we can tell for sure is there is people don't, they read the number, they might have an immediate impression, but they do forget about that. That's the first thing. I think that has been quite a bit of quite a bit of research in psychology in the past few decades. The other thing is, statistics in the context of the pandemic. The first few weeks when the lockdowns, started in the UK, for example, about 99% of people, the online population in the UK got in the news, got to the media, to TV and all the things. So they because at the time there was nothing but the number that can tell you, you know, what actually, how could you do, what are you supposed to do and all those things, because everything was dependent on the numbers so much. But that actually went up quite quickly afterwards, I think. But there, overall, I think we haven't done any research with the audience yet, but we did, not directly for this project, but we did a bit of interview with about 60 people for another project, and one of the issues that came up in the interviews was, you know, what they call statistical fatigue with the data during the pandemic. So it was quite, you know, useful initially, but then it came to a point where people just get so tired with that, because both because of the negative nature of the numbers, and also because, you know, it's hard to digest. So overall, the journalists we interviewed so far are still in, and I think some of the scientists are also, there is a hope that, you know, after this there is a new appetite for data and journalism, for data in the public anyway, because, you know, because of this whole, you know, pervasive presence of news in the past few years, and I don't know whether we are going to that point or not, but, you know, there is that strong hope that people are more, you know, have a better appetite for numbers now. Did I answer your question?
Can I just add a very quick number to that? Because we had that in the analysis, so very briefly. So from the overall data we found for the mainstream media, the COVID-related posts that were referring to incident rates, statistics, and so on, that was about a fifth of what we found there, and it was constant. So there was this constant noise of, you know, breaking news on new infections, regional live tickers on the latest data, on local outbreak numbers, daily infection numbers, renewed increases, and so on. So it was constant, and it's quite a substantial part of the coverage there. So the use of statistics is really like it's more like a background noise, and there was this kind of horse race reporting in the beginning. We're doing better than the other countries. How good are we in terms of numbers? That was used extensively during the first year.
Okay, very good. Christoph Neuberg, or Herr Eisniger?
Yes, I just wanted to add some insights from our study, because that's something we also looked at, how journalism dealt with numbers and statistics. And what our finding was that at the beginning, clearly numbers were contextualized only to a very small degree. So that also we found really quality deficiencies, how journalism was dealing with statistics and numbers. But also the finding was that how journalism was dealing with the numbers and statistics improved. So the learning curve was quite steep toward the whole time period, and in the end, how journalism was dealing with numbers and statistics was much, much better. So we found less problematic comparisons between countries with completely different circumstances. So, and this shows really that journalism also had to learn how to deal with the numbers and statistics, and at least to some extent, they really learned how to deal with statistics and numbers, and did it better in the second phase of the whole corona pandemic.
Yeah, very good. Christoph Neuberger.
Yes, thank you so much for your insightful presentations. I have a simple and also short question. When comparing COVID-19 to other crisis issues, we have seen recently, for example, the arrival of refugees and the flood in the summer. What do you think are the main differences between the coverage and discussion of COVID-19 and these other crises? What are the special characteristics of the topic in social media, but also in mass media?
Who's supposed to answer? To whom do you direct the question? Do you
Mark or Thorsten?
Okay. Mark has to put his mic on. Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Thank you, Christoph. Of course, a very interesting, but not easy to answer question. What are the differences between this different crises? Perhaps also a question might be, what are the similarities between crises? I think what we regularly see when we analyze news reporting generally on crisis, that we have a concentration on specific topics, and this displacement effects, as I was showing also for the corona pandemic. What I would say is perhaps an important difference is that we find much more experts, scientific experts, other experts in this corona pandemic, because of course this crisis was clearly not only, but to a large extent about numbers, about statistics, incidence rates, and so on and so forth. So what I would say is this was a crisis very much related to science, to experts, and also a high dependence. If we look at the politics, how the decisions were made, so these decisions were to a large extent dependent on what science was saying, how we have to look at this whole crisis, what forecasts are, how these forecasts are perceived. So I would say this was one of the major differences, or might be a major difference to other crises such as the refugee crisis. So we find other actor structures in this crisis, which are typical for this specific crisis, the pandemic crisis.
I also think that it's kind of, it was a worldwide phenomenon, and it was really like the first reaction of journalism was also confusion, because for them it was something that was really new. The typical crisis mode didn't really fit. And I think that's also because they were affected themselves in a way in their daily lives, but also in their work. So I know from a lot of journalists that they were also in lockdown and basically kind of shut off their usual sources, their working environment. And you can see that also kind of reflected in the early reporting, where they tried to make sense of it as well. And there they kind of, didn't have something to rely on. And you can see that normalization process in the first month, in the first 2 or 3 months, where they slowly started to kind of gain, kind of control of the situation again themselves in a way. So I think also the first weeks were kind of, they were shocked by it as themselves.
Yeah.
Let me take a question from the audience. Rainer Bromme asks Thorsten Quandt, how large is the share or the percentage of science denialism, anti-vaccine, etc. messages among COVID-related messages on social media, as for example, Facebook? I understood that this share is large. The background or the reason for my question is the fact that approximately just 10 to 20% of the German population actually adhere to such beliefs. How do you explain the differences in magnitude?
I don't think I can give concrete numbers on that, because we haven't done, as I said before, a research on Facebook per se or the social media, but just on the alternative news media. And as I mentioned before, their anti-vaxxers and also conspiracies were a topic. Conspiracies weren't shared that much, but the anti-vaxxer movement was quite a big chunk of it. So that was relevant there. And the question here, why is that relevant, and where does the magnitude come from? I think some of it is also fault of the journalistic coverage of it, because I think there was a balances bias phenomenon involved here, like we know from climate crisis, where journalists think, they have to cover the other opinion as well, although it's just a small percentage. And you could clearly see that, especially in the summer 2020, journalists also covered the Querdenk movement and all of that in an extensive amount. So it wasn't that they were kind of supporting that, but they were covering it as a social phenomenon and gave it more power and magnitude that it actually had in society. For example, this Vigen Cook Attila Hildmann. I think in our analysis, he showed up as one of the most important persons in Germany in journalism in 2020. I think he was on position 24 and more important than many other public figures. And that is due to this, coverage of that. So I think it works kind of as an amplifier. And we know that, as I said before, from other topics as well, like climate crisis. So in this indirect way, I think, and this is not kind of a criticism, but it's kind of a systemic thing. Indirectly, I think journalism contributed to that as well.
Okay, Thomas Schildhauer.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for the deep insight in your research experiences and results. I have a question to Mark Eisenegger. On one of your charts, you presented that science reporting is only 2% compared to politics and other areas. And so my question is, does that cover also social media, or was that, no, that was
Yes, this was only related to journalistic news media reporting. And also what is also important to know, only articles, contributions which focus science in the center of the corresponding articles. But nevertheless, of course, it's a very small share we see here. And what is also true, of course, that it would be interesting to compare this proportion or this share with other types of media, social media, but we do not have yet the data to make here any statements about this.
Maybe anyone else from this group has information about that, Thorsten, or no?
No, we haven't done that analysis as well. So,
okay, thank you.
Let me follow up to Eisenegger with another question from the audience. Andreas Beer asked, did your research focus on Twitter exclusively, or did you incorporate other social media as well? Twitter is often found to attract journalists, scientists, or political actors, while other social groups prefer other channels, for instance, Facebook or discussion groups on Telegram or Signal. This might have been an influence on your observation that misinformation wasn't widely spread by the Twitter users you investigated.
Mm. Yes, a very good remark. Also, to some extent, I would say justified. We have a project on the way now that will also look at platforms, at other platforms, and I fully agree that platforms, messenger services such as Telegram, Signal are of course very important, because there we find groups very critical of vaccination, for example. So we have to look at these platforms too, also to be able to make statements how diffusion is going on from these communities, these more separate communities to a broader public sphere. So we have to include this kind of platforms, but nevertheless, I think Twitter is an important and also interesting social media platform, because as you wrote, what we find here is a kind of elite discourse, elite communication. We find there politicians, journalists, also scientists, and this is an important pathway for example, critical interpretations to find their way into a broader public sphere, also to find their way into, for example, mainstream media, journalistic media. And that's why we have to look, or why it's interesting to look at Twitter as a platform. But fully right, it's not enough. We have also to include the other platforms. But here, of course, you know this, we have some methodological issues, because it's not that easy to get access to this kind of platforms such as Telegram, messenger services, WhatsApp, for example, also very important. But this is not an argument against what you are saying or writing. We have to do it, do this, and that's what we will do in our next project.
Given the fact that we have so far heard about the role of media reporting and the interaction between traditional media and and social media platforms. This fits in well. As you probably all know, during the pandemic, the number of publications has shot up dramatically. And the most important role in this, at least in the first phase, was played by preprints due to the possibility of publishing preprints. This was used by scholars extensensively. And the question that Francois and his co-author have posed themselves was, in what way, or do the especially the online news media take note of the fact that preprints are uncertified scientific reports. In other words, they have not gone through the normal the mechanism of peer review, and therefore they are preliminary or provisional communications. And the question is, to what extent have the journalists that are reporting on online news media, to what extent have they actually reported or warned the readers about the fact that this is provisional? And they have found, among many other things, that in 59% of online news media articles, no statement of provisionality was provided when reporting about a preprint. As a matter of fact, we have a famous case in Germany where the famous tabloid newspaper Bild did a report on COVID based on a preprint. It was actually a critique or a criticism of the virologist Drosten of one of his articles, which was taken to be sort of certified news, and which it wasn't, and this raised a lot of discussion and criticism. So, but the conclusion that Schalkwijk and Dudek come to is that journalists are not adhering to norms related to factual reporting and the non-suppression of essential information, nor are they following emerging guidelines specifically related to the reporting of scientific information from preprints. But on the other hand, they also note that in spite of that, norms such as verifying the veracity of information, including those published in preprints, are still influencing how journalists report on the pandemic. It would have been much better to let Francois talk about this himself, but we can just, for the sake of discussion, we can note here that it is an important aspect that with this particular type of scientific communication, namely preprints, journalistic reporting is meeting yet another challenge, and either adding to misunderstandings or misinformation, or becoming responsible in warning the reader of the provisionality of this type of communication. Okay, let's go on in the program then with Dominique Brossard, who will join us now. Now I can see you, Dominique.
I'm here.
Hi, go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Peter. Thank you so much. And very interesting first session. I'm really looking forward to continue the broad discussion. But first of all, I would say thank you for having me, Peter, and thank you so much for organizing this excellent workshop. I'm not presenting the study per se, but I hope to actually produce some lines of thoughts that can provoke a useful discussion. And also, I need to acknowledge that the ideas that are proposed in this presentation were developed with two students of ours, Nick Straub and Becca Dietz, actually, and Isabel Freeling, who's actually a researcher in Germany right now. So I need to acknowledge them as I move forward. So what I'd like to discuss here is the role of fact-checking in times of COVID-19 and argue that the way it has been approached from the starting of the pandemic was not actually productive and may have contributed to issues of distrust and potentially lack of protective behavior by a number of publics in the United States. But and I think it's important at this point to just give a brief context for my talk. Again, if it's true that in April 2020, there was a plethora of inconsistent information related to the pandemic worldwide, we need to also acknowledge that contexts were very different from country to country, and within countries also cultural context related to perception of the risks related to the pandemic may have been very different as well. But what is true though, and I think this is obviously something that's worth mentioning, is uncertainty was high at the beginning of the pandemic, and scientific empirical evidence was scarce. And I think this relates to some extent, Peter, to what you were saying about Francois' presentation, you know, the notion that preprints were taken at face value as representing scientific evidence and so on, where science was defined as the pandemic was moving forward. And what does it mean as us when we think about, I cannot see my talks, okay. What does it mean as us in United States? Well, the context of United States was specific as we were, you know, in a presidency that was highly controversial, a president, former President Trump, you know, being perceived and actually correctly as not trusting scientific information, which means as a whole, there was the perception among a large share of the public United States that scientific facts were not trusted. You put that in context with the fact that there was the perception that some media outlets were, you know, more than others, not trusting scientific information, and that were portraying science facts in a way that was not factually correct. To the point that in early 2020, journalism professor raised the alarm about the quality of information on Fox News. Fox News being a channel, media channel, extremely important media channel in the United States, largely conservative. And these professors were raising the alarm that the quality of information on Fox News related to the pandemic was actually problematic and had led with increased risk and even a death among some people in Arizona that had taken potential, you know, chemicals that were supposed to help with the pandemic, but obviously were not. So put that in the context of a broad, you know, trust-related issue. 84% of Fox News viewers believes that Fox News covered COVID-19 very well. So from Fox News perspective, Fox News were portraying the science the way they should. From others' perspective, they were not doing so. And why do I raise this issue? Because it's important for us to remember that actually misinformation as a whole is perceived as a risk by most Americans in 2019. In late 2019, more Americans view made-up news as a very big problem for the country than terrorism, illegal immigration, racism, and sexism. So the risk of misinformation was there as a perception among the American public, but the notion of what that misinformation was not there as clearly defined as we were. This led us, myself and my colleagues that I mentioned, Nikki Kreis, Isabel Frelin, Becca Beetz, to publish an opinion piece in the Journal of Risk Research in April 2020. And what we argue here, and that what I will share with you today, is that we think that we should think about fact-checking and correcting, misinformation as a risk communication endeavor. That is actually, it's a multi-layered risk-related issue that goes beyond just misinformation, particularly in times of COVID-19 or pandemics and so on. And the early times of the pandemic made this very clear, and I think we actually face this issue again and again. I need to actually give a caveat to my points here, is that this apply to the United States. I think it can be applied to other contexts as well, but obviously the way, the layered of this risk of misinformation may be very different in Germany and other parts of the world. So what do I mean by fact is as risk communication? So if we think of misinformation as the risk of misinformation, it brings us back to the issue of defining risk. When you think of risk, we, in the risk communication scholars, and I know there's like some famous ones in the room here, we think of risk in context. Risk has to be defined, at the intersection to some extent of the scientific assessment, what that risk is, and the public perception of the risk. Because at the end of the day, the risk as defined by expert is not perceived as a risk, is the public does not perceive of a risk. In other words, a risk is socially constructed. As long as you don't define it as a risk, it doesn't exist, right? And that's what I will claim is important to think in terms of misinformation. And this brings me back to something that the National Academy of Science in the United States, actually their arm, National Research Council, which is the branch that actually calls for consensus committees to come together to give a sense of what's the consensus related to an important problem. And in 1996, the National Research Council put together a report that was, aiming at understanding risk and understanding how we can inform decision in democratic society when we think of risk. And the main conclusion was that a purely technical assessment of risk could result in an analysis that accurately answer the wrong question and will be of little use to decision maker. So let's think of misinformation. And who decides what misinformation is, and who should communicate misinformation, and what will that misinformation lead as far as consequences? I think this is something that we need to think about, because the way we define in risk has consequences, right? So fact-checking has become the norm, with the idea that fact-checking is, identified in news media some claims that do not correspond to the scientific consensus. Again, let me remind my first points here, that idea that we are in a context where science is defining itself as we move on. Scientific facts are, fluid. Those preprints that haven't been gone through peer review process are sign like evidence and so on. So what are we correcting? Misinformation according to whom? Who decide what's the factual information that needs to be corrected, and who is the audience that actually is perceiving that misinformation? So corrected by whom, it's a very important problem, because in the United States, the fact checkers are traditionally hosted by a news organization. And I will tell you a little more about this in a few minutes. But if you remember what I told you at the beginning of my talk, talking about Fox News, 84% of Fox News viewers actually trust the information in Fox News. Obviously, these viewers will trust fact checkers that are hosted in Fox News and are not hosted anywhere else. The traditional fact check in the United States are varied. You have Snopes, Check Your Facts, also some that are hosted at, well-known academic institutions, such as Fact Check at the Annenberg Public Policy Center, Political Fact at the Poynter Institute, and so on. When we think about where those fact-checked organizations are hosted, on top of the one by the news media organization, we realize that actually it raises the issue of who is, the fact checker and in which context it's deployed. Let me explain what I mean right now. If we think about misinformation and fact-checking through the lens of risk, you realize that misinformation risks are hard to define and are multi-layered. Number one, if you ask Americans at the early onset of the pandemic if they were concerned about the risk of the pandemic, most of them said that they were really concerned about the health consequences. The majority of them were actually concerned about the economic consequences, and actually even more were concerned about the financial impact it had in their personal life. Then you realize that like the way misinformation was construed was just in terms of public health. So missing the point about what actually was concerning to most Americans. I'm not saying that obviously health-related information is not important, and incorrect information about health is certainly something that we should care about. But disregarding what others may think about misinformation and what's important as far as risk is also problematic. The second thing that we need to remember is that when I tell you that the Republican and Democrat have different views of what misinformation means, this is not trivial. Republicans tend to think that news media should not be trusted, and they tend to exaggerate risk related to the pandemic. Democrats do not. It means that if you need to communicate misinformation with Republicans, what you will need to actually correct is the fact that the information in most media is in fact correct and not the nature of the misinformation itself. So attempt to fact check information will be complicated by varying level of trust among audiences. If journalists are not trusted in the first place, connecting that information about health or others within news media outlets will be to some extent not very constructive. And on top of that, risk by definitions are related to uncertainty, which means that articulating facts may be insufficient or rather impossible, because at the end of the day, the information is coming together as science is deployed in terms of pandemics and the issue cycle that is related to the production of scientific knowledge. So what we argue is that it is actually counterproductive from media outlets to, number one, fact check information if they want to correct this information about others than their viewers and their readers, and also completely counterproductive to actually define misinformation without a relationship with the COVID-19 risk-related issues as well. So misinformation is a risk in itself. Like the way we define the risk of misinformation should be thought about in the way we think of the risk related to COVID-19 definitions. So I was telling you as an example here, obviously it depends on the audience we have in mind, but in the highly polarized context of United States, it is worthwhile thinking in terms of political ideology. The seriousness of the disease and individual risk will be different among different populations. The uncertainty related to COVID-19 risk definition problems will also be related to the COVID-19 risk definition problem. The trustworthiness of the communicators that tell us about the risk related to COVID-19 is important to think about. And I'm not going to go in details in all those levels, but at the end of the day, and I'm sure Dietz following my talk is going to talk about that much more, COVID-19 risk is conceptualized based on issue-related values and beliefs. It's been well established that we actually make sense of information through processes such as motivated reasoning and relying on our values and other perceptual filters to make sense of complicated issue, and at the end to actually have a judgment of the risk that's defining, a certain issue. But put that in context with misinformation risk definition in the specific context of misinformation. What is the definition that we're trying to address here? Are we actually interested in the magnitude of misinformation and the potential, impact on behavior and attitude? And this is something that, again, we lack empirical evidence to conclude for sure. Are we thinking in terms of the source of misinformation? That's what we tend to want to correct. Are we thinking in terms of the trustworthiness of the fact checkers? Because at the end of the day, if the fact checkers themselves are not trusted when correcting whatever misinformation is out there, again, this is not very productive. Or are we thinking in terms of how that potential misinformation is filtered through individual values and beliefs? And recent research that we've done with different professors and other colleagues has shown that anxiety was one of those emotions that made people actually share more information than other things. So the emotional value related to that misinformation may be something that should be communicating through different elements that wish to address misinformation as risk-related issue. Going back to more context here. Again, in 2019, only 50% of Americans agree that fact-checking by news outlets tend to deal fairly with all sides. Framing it differently, 49% and so of America thought that news outlets did not deal fairly with all sides. And most mistrust the media, which means, again, going back to my point, to who should be, correcting misinformation. The second thing that is useful when we think in terms of misinformation as a risk and not as a fact-related issue is that we know, again, from risk perception, risk psychology, and so on, that people who believe in some issue, context, do not have a knowledge problem. As a matter of fact, people tend to believe in the science that support their belief. So it's not a correcting issue we're facing here. It's a belief system that is actually more related to the subjective aspect of a risk than the objective part. So fact-checking as risk communication is difficult because risk is subjective by nature, right? What are we correcting? What is that subjective element that we need to be taking into account when we think of misinformation as a risk? And risk is uncertain by nature, right? And interesting, the fact-checking exercise, just because of the name itself, seems to be forgetting that risk, that uncertainty level. So where does that leave us? I mean, I raise question, I propose a conceptual framework. Well, it leaves us to the fact that fact-checking itself is not an approach that's useful. And I'm not quite convinced, and I'll be happy to discuss more, that news media should even engage in that exercise as well. We know for decades of research in science communication that at the end of the day, trustworthy messengers are the ones who carry the most weight. We know also from risk psychology and risk communication that the same message will be perceived very differently according to who communicate this message. So misinformation and correcting facts in a context of a very fluid and uncertain time seems to be something that should be left on the ground by trusted actors. And by the way, a very recent study by MIT that looked at 18,000 Americans and did actually an experimental design using videos that use doctors as the primary communicators showed that indeed doctors in their office are the most trustworthy, providers of information in the context of pandemics. So food for thought here about fact-checking. And also, I think it's worth also remembering that we have a vast, number of research outlets that have shown again and again the importance of the science and science communication. And I know I don't need to convince this group, but just to go back to the context of United States, we still are in a conundrum here. On the one hand, Collins, like, that was actually the head of the Human Genome Project, just, stepped down as the head of the National Institute of Health in the United States, and kept on saying that we don't know how to correct misinformation because we don't have science to tell us. On the other hand, we have the science advisor for President Biden who tell us that social science is one of the most important thing to take into account when we think about pandemics and issues facing the nation. So I think the message for all of us in this group is like, we need to communicate our science, and we need to actually make sure that our social science input do not stay among ourselves. And that's why I commend Peter for organizing this workshop with a wide range of stakeholders. And going back to the United States, we put together with the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine a network of social scientists, the Societal Expert Action Network, that's supposed to facilitate rapid and actionable response to social behavior and economic related COVID-19 question. I'm actually honored to be part of this network and in this executive committee. And what we do is we connect with local policymakers on the ground to give them insight from social science to answer the questions that they need, to take into account to make sure the community is protected and moving forward. The realities here is that actually the media is not part of that, apart from like the local media for which we try to foster a trust relationship. So I would leave it at that and be happy to discuss this further. But my point that I would like for us to discuss is, what is the role of news media as far as fact-checking in terms of crisis? I would argue that mainstream media may have a role that's more limited than we think, and conceptualizing misinformation as a risk may actually give us some insight in why this is the case. So I'm going to stop sharing here, and I'm going to turn it to Dietram for his presentation.
Thank you, Dominique. Now you have started with what I would call the plot thickens as we're looking at sort of more conceptual issues in this topic. Okay, Dietram, go ahead before we then get into the general discussion.
Thank you. And let me, as I'm sharing my screen, let me add to what Dominique said and others, and thank the organizers for putting this together. I think so far it's been extremely fascinating and is really beginning to connect some dots in a nice way. Peter, as you said, on the plot thickening, maybe I can complicate things a little bit more and throw in a few more provocative statements that later on we can either sort out if they're wrong or maybe worth pursuing. And I want to talk basically about two big bullet points. And I put here intentionally, this is a picture of the UW-Madison campus back in the day, and now these are all sports fields and fitness facilities and dorms and everything else. But the point being that, when we first started this idea of land-grant universities, one of the key arguments that were presented in US Congress was actually that we needed to address a misinformation problem among the public, which is why land was granted literally to universities who would then engage partly not just in doing research, but in making that research accessible and useful for the public and help close knowledge gaps. This is why most land-grant universities, old land grants, still have communication departments, social science communication departments in colleges of agriculture and life sciences, so surrounded by genetics, UW-Madison being one. But I want to start with the first bullet point that basically makes the argument that COVID has given us an excuse to return to a model that I thought we had blown out of the water, and that is the knowledge deficit model. And I'll come to that in a second, but then I want to talk about 4 challenges really quickly in the time that I have that I think and this goes to Christoph Neuberger's question from earlier, how is COVID different from other issues? And I think there were 4 unique challenges that overlap with other issues to some degree, but to some degree also are very unique to extremely fast-moving science under immense public scrutiny, which are really the 2 characteristics that I think made COVID complicated. But let me start with my argument that we're going back to knowledge deficit thinking, right? Knowledge deficit thinking, of course, has always been this argument that if people only knew the science, they would make better choices, and choices that are more in line with the scientific community. And of course, we've shown that in dozens is probably not even capturing it, probably hundreds of studies, that at best is a tenuous link, and at worst probably doesn't work that way at all. That hasn't stopped us during COVID-19 from basically announcing that we're in the middle of an infodemic. And it's the WHO term saying, there's so much information, hard for people to separate signal from noise. And so as a result, lots of misinformation spreading. And we all took that hook, line, and sinker without necessarily doing a lot of research or documenting that we have more of a misinformation problem now than we had 20 or 30 years ago. In fact, a lot of the conspiracy thinking and the misinformation that did float around, Torsten was joking about this earlier, about Bill Gates and how he had been connected to him. That stuff has been around forever. The idea that Bill Gates is supporting vaccines for personal gain or population control. So it's very unclear empirically that we're actually seeing more misinformation than we did before. We all spent a year and a half holed up in front of social media with little else to do. And so maybe our anecdotal thinking overrides our systematic social scientific thinking. More importantly, and I do mean that literally, more importantly, we have very limited evidence that misinformation is actually linked to the kinds of dependent variables that we do care about. Ultimately, do I care if a bunch of people think that the Earth is flat? No, because it doesn't have any influence on their behavior other than them taking a rocket in the air to see if they can see the horizon or something and crashing. That may be the most adverse outcome. For COVID, we immediately assumed that being misinformed meant you're not going to socially distance or physically distance, you're not going to get vaccinated, and so on. And again, that link between information and behavior is tenuous at best. And we know that information doesn't translate necessarily in behavior, or that vaccine hesitancy is driven by a lot of factors other than information. And maybe more importantly, or third one, equally importantly rather, corrective interventions can produce a whole bunch of things. One, backfire effects. Do they happen a lot? No. Can they happen in rare circumstances? Absolutely. And it's been well documented in spite of the initial claims, I think, being overstated. Number 2, us engaging on social media in corrective interventions and engaging with maybe less than smart statements that politicians are making or whatever else actually increases the salience of that misinformation. If that's Donald Trump's tweets that got literally hundreds of hours of coverage on news media, giving them additional reach. And of course, then for social media, giving them additional digital oxygen, because they end up, the more engagement a post gets, correct or not, the more likely it appears high on people's timelines, and prominent, and also have a much longer half-life. Here, ironically, this is a study that a really poorly done study that linked misinformation to Donald Trump, that we all reposted because we wanted to believe it. A really, really bad piece of social science that just really is a good example of that within the academic community. So maybe that problem of misinformation is more complex than it and maybe not as novel as we thought it was, but we have 4 additional challenges that I want to talk through really quickly. And the first one, and I intentionally phrased this somewhat provocatively, we were faced during COVID-19, and we continue to be faced with the catch-22 of having to correct or wanting to correct misinformation that we know to be wrong with science that we also know might not turn out to be right. And we've known this for a while now. This is not new. Going back to Torsten's chronology from the beginning, there's of course a chronology layered on top of that of policy making that tried to follow the COVID science. And And that was complicated from the beginning. The moment we knew that there's a virus that may cause a pandemic, the moment people started wearing masks, all of us went on Amazon and bought up every single piece of personal protective equipment, which in the US led the CDC to recommend that people actually initially think, don't buy up all the masks, don't wear masks, leave those to first responders. And then reversed course and said, well, wear cloth masks because we know there's asymptomatic and pre-symptomatic spread. All of that was then complicated by the World Health Organization coming out and saying, well, asymptomatic spread is actually very rare. And then science journalists and public sat there and said, wait, what? We're not supposed to wear masks. We're supposed to wear masks to prevent asymptomatic spread, but now you're telling us that's really rare. So 2 days later, the World Health Organization walks that back and says, well, what we mean is it's hard to document. It's not really necessarily rare. But then we made things worse by very publicly, and this is what I meant earlier for COVID. COVID moved really fast and under immense public scrutiny. Normally, we can have these debates within the scientific community and nobody pays attention. This time, the New York Times wrote about them. And everybody saw conflicts between teams of researchers that had shown that masks were effective or not, and with no clear resolution. And policy players jumped on this pretty quickly. This is a conservative commentator, Laura Ingraham, who commented on something that a number of us have mentioned now, and that is the large number, Peter mentioned this earlier, the large number of retracted studies in the last year and a half. And her point is, next time they tell you to trust the science, remember all the stuff that got retracted from the Lancet and elsewhere, or the bad data that they used. So we're trying to win a short-term battle over pieces of misinformation, with Dominique's warning being very timely here. We're trying to win short-term battles, and we risk losing the long-term war over science being the most trusted arbiter of knowledge in our society. All of that is complicated by something that we haven't really talked all that much about, and that is human nature. We're making the assumption that, of course, people are sitting there just wanting the right information, and if we can just give it to them, then the world would be a better place. But that, of course, ignores a good chunk of human psychology and research since the 80s that has shown us that it doesn't matter if we all agree that a fact is true or not. If our priors, if our values, our beliefs make us engage in confirmation bias, meaning we weigh more heavily those facts that fit our priors. We assimilate in biased ways new scientific information into what we already believe, and we do that to protect our political, our religious, our paranoid, whatever identities for Querdenker and others. The more important thing, though, for science is, or the maybe pernicious conclusion, is that means the exact same facts about COVID, even if we've corrected them and everybody believes now that this is the right fact, will mean very different things to different people and will draw very different conclusions. Mask wearing in the US having become almost a virtue signaling over which party you belong to, and Joe Biden, of course, infamously declaring that science is back now, that the Democrats are back, and implying that the science is not something that Republicans should worry about. And this is exactly what that leads to. These are data from early in the pandemic. This is April 2020, asking people if they believe the official reports of numbers of quantitative information from the US government. And I'll just highlight a couple numbers here. 2/3 of Democrats, almost 2/3 of Democrats, believe that those numbers are not correct, that they're probably higher in reality. And there's some scientific truth probably to that, comorbidity, other things. For Republicans, you have 2 in 5, a relative majority, who believe that those numbers are, who also believe that these numbers are wrong, but in the opposite direction. They think they're exaggerated. Why? Because they think Trump is doing a great job, so those numbers must be wrong. Biased assimilation, I just discount official government numbers. Democrats don't like Trump. They think he's doing a poor job, so those numbers must be higher. So they go in the opposite direction. The exact same facts end up meaning very different things to different people, even though these are the official government numbers that we're putting out. There's no discourse about them being right or wrong in the sense that these are official government numbers, but in terms of how people interpret them, to Dominique's point from earlier, that is a very different story. In Germany, not exactly the same data, but this is in December 2020, asking people if what is in place at that time as far as measures against the COVID-19 are going too far or are not going far enough. So not going far enough, especially if you look at the ultra left of the political spectrum. Well, the world looks very different at the more libertarian end for the FDP or at the more very strongly ultra conservative end for the AfD. So again, people looking at exactly the same policy proposals and interpreting them very, very, very differently. Classic case of motivated reasoning, to the point where my earlier point that it's not about getting correct information out there, it's about how we all make sense of that information. My third challenge is maybe, again, a somewhat provocative one, and especially in light of recent calls by academic academies in the US, or by at least one of them, to call explicitly for vaccine mandates. And that's an interesting line to cross, because of course, science can provide a lot of answers on what happens if we implement certain policy choices, but it can't really provide an answer to the normative question if we should. Those are democratic questions, those are political questions. And the moment science is seen as being in the business of supporting particular policy choices, it leaves itself very vulnerable to attacks from other political parties saying you are basically supporting a particular slice of the political spectrum. So I'm not a big fan of that ever happening, and I'll just put that out there and we can come back to that later. That doesn't take away from the question, how can we make sure that when policy does get made, not by scientists, but by policymakers and by people, that the best available science gets taken into account. A lot of my research over the years is focused on framing and language, and the idea of herd immunity has always been a bad term. Nobody wants to be part of a herd of sheep. Nobody wants to follow along blindly. And terms like community immunity and other ways of framing the issue that actually align much more with where people are coming from, that align much more with priors that may not make them engage in biased assimilation and confirmation biases, is, I think, one key step. A really good example of that, and one that speaks to a second necessity, is the idea of answering the questions that people are actually asking. And this echoes something that Dominique said earlier from the Academy's report. For a lot of people, COVID was not a public health issue, or not primarily a public health issue. It was an economic issue. It was an issue that threatened their livelihoods, their way of life. And for them, the idea that they should be engaging in protective behaviors was really a question of why does engaging in these behaviors connect to what is important to me, meaning economic concerns. Goldman Sachs spoke to this quite powerfully, as did The Economist, when The Economist said that every day that an American is not wearing a mask costs us $56 in GDP losses. And you can multiply that up pretty quickly and scale it up pretty quickly and realize how much money that costs us because the economy reopens later and so on. But very rarely do we talk about it in those ways. Much more frequently, we talk about how many people will die, how much more catastrophic the situation is now. And we basically lost frame a situation that we should really gain frame around what matters to people and what kind of priors they bring to the table. This echoes something that Nguyen said earlier on the provisionary nature of evidence, and something that we haven't done well during COVID. We answered misinformation with science that we claimed was settled, and we knew it wasn't. So that was not just an oversight, that was actually almost reckless, because we knew exactly that the science would be changing and would get better over time. But we were faced with the urgent need to make policy recommendations, and so we made them claiming that the science was settled. And every time the science changed or things didn't turn out quite the way they turned out, for example, on the early promise of vaccines would be doing in terms of reducing viral load or other things, and all of a sudden we realized, no, that's not happening, and we had to walk claims back at the peril of, again, losing that long-term war. We do this all the time, I think, in medicine, chemotherapy being a great example. We still use that for some cancers, and we use it knowing full well that there's going to be better science available, that we're going to have gold nanoshells, targeted drug delivery, and that chemotherapy is on its way out. But we still use it, and we're making the value proposition that it's just simply the best thing that we have at the moment. The last thing I'll mention really quickly on challenge 3 is the idea that we need to, when we know what our dependent variable is, and that may not be information, that may be behavior, there are lots of insights from behavioral psychology, or behavioral social science that tell us how to change behavior. Social norms being one of them. We know from study after study that people put solar on their roofs, and not in Germany because there are regulations, but in the US, where there are none, they put solar on their roofs because their neighbor has gotten solar. This is actually in my neighborhood. I took that picture 3 or 4 weeks ago. In a house getting solar right next to another house that gets solar. Same thing for behavioral, for social contagion around COVID behaviors and so on. And we've completely underutilized a lot of these things. This brings me to my very last set of challenges, and I'll end on those on that slide. And maybe again with something that's a bit blasphemous, but you know, we keep hearing, and this is a theme we've heard today, and I absolutely agree with it, that we need a solid baseline trust in science, and if we risk that, then that's really dangerous. But I also would argue that some of some folks in the STEM or in the MINT community would love to enjoy really almost unlimited public trust, and that's what they're shooting for. But that's actually as democratically dangerous or undesirable as little trust. And this is a poorly drawn curve here. But if public trust in science dips below a certain point, it becomes democratically negative in its effect, because it's completely dysfunctional. But it's equally dysfunctional in an age of AI, COVID, and CRISPR for the public to simply defer 100% to the scientific community and saying, we trust you to do the right thing, just tell us what to do. I know some in the scientific community might like that, but it's not democratically desirable. Number 2, sometimes trust is not the right mechanism. Some of you will recognize these pictures on the left top. You see Henrietta Lacks, whose cells were used by Hopkins and Johns Hopkins University and other researchers without her knowledge. She's become the poster child of why communities of color here in the US often don't trust the scientific community. Same for Tuskegee, the picture on the top right. Syphilis experiments where African-American males were not treated without telling them, took syphilis home to their families. Again, another reason for a low level of trust among communities of color in the scientific community. Our response from the scientific community often is, well, we need to rebuild trust because of these historical inequities. True, except for in the UK, if I'm a Black mother, I have a 4 times higher chance of dying at some point while I'm carrying my child to term or giving birth than a white mother. In the US, that proportion is 3 times higher for an African-American mother than a white mother. That's not, our job here is not to rebuild trust. Our job is actually to close inequities in treatment and in health outcomes, and then trust will follow, but the dependent variable, again, is a different one. And then this is, I'll put that flippantly, science needs to stop effing up. And this is it was a great example, something that happened in the US. In most college campuses, we expanded on a program that came out of 9/11 of testing wastewater out of buildings to make inferences of who is in there, or if people who are in the building have a certain health condition. And it was really tempting. Basically, what we did is we tested wastewater, and it allowed us to identify COVID cases long before they were symptomatic. Because of course we could pick up viral load already in wastewater, went in and then tested every student, something that we couldn't do all the time. Highly controversial, of course, because it also allows universities to test for drugs, for everything else, and it's done without necessarily students knowing. It's potentially extremely invasive, like so many things that we put in place during COVID. But to make matters worse, scientists basically spoke to the New York Times, and this is, to me, to this day, fascinating how a scientist would say this to the New York Times, saying, well, what we're going to do, we know it's controversial, but what we're going to do is we're going to go on college campuses where there's more trust in the science, we get uptake there, And then we take the technology that we know may get pushback from the general public once it's scaled up at universities and take it to the rest of the public. And you can already see how that is a recipe for communication disaster. I'll leave you with one last one, and that was David Dowdy last week, Johns Hopkins epidemiologist, about the latest round of COVID, wave 4 in Germany, or Omicron, new variant. And I think this is a very well taken tweet. We knew at the beginning very little. We continue to have limited knowledge of, is this going to be a game changer for how COVID spreads? Is it possible that it's going to be catastrophic? Absolutely. Do we know much about what it will do societally and medically? And the answer is no, we don't. But we're not communicating like we know very little. We're communicating in ways that is very panic focused and very policy informed by certain science focus, which is exactly what I was pushing back against earlier. And even a year and a half in, or 2 years in, we're still making the exact same mistakes that Adam Marcus and Ivan Oransky warned in a piece in Wired magazine in March of 2020, when they said, we need to go into this pandemic knowing that science will get it wrong. We need to go into this pandemic knowing that we will make missteps. And if we do that, we will be okay. But if we pretend that the science is more settled than it is, we will not. And I think this is exactly where we ended up being. So I'll leave it with that. Hopefully that was provocative enough to get a bunch of questions and pushback and lead to a very fruitful discussion. Thank you so much again.
Okay, now the floor is open for discussion. I see one question here. I'll read it out by Lillian Fish. I think the term raises an interesting point about the role of scientists in advising policy. In fact, the German Wissenschaftsbarometer, science barometer that explore public opinion on science and research on a yearly basis just found that 50% of the respondents agreed that scientists should recommend certain decisions to politicians based on scientific results. A further 31% agreed that scientists should explain possible decisions and consequences, but not recommend decisions, and 18% that scientists should only inform politicians about scientific results. So quite a large part of the public, in a way, seems to want scientists to have a more active role in decision-making. Where might this come from, and how should scientists navigate these demands and expectations? I guess that's to you, Dietrich, I guess.
Yeah, and since Dominique is not unmuted, I'll take a first stab and she can jump in. And I think it's an interesting piece of data that I'd love to see how that plays out once you talk about different applications. So let's go through this, right? Would this hold if you ask people if we should implement speed limits and if scientists tell us to implement speed limits in Germany? Because we know that if we lower speed limits, we're going to save tens of thousands of lives. What if they tell us that we should drink a lot less alcohol, and scientists make decisions about how much alcohol everybody can drink, because every single cancer that we know, or almost every single cancer, is the risk goes up with drinking alcohol. So long story short, I think what we're having here, and we see this when we look at public attitudes, for example, for the death penalty, we see this all the time in the US, that they peak around certain key events that end up just being top of mind for the public when they answer these questions. In this particular one, and I'm not one to speculate about how questions would work out differently if they were asked at different times or primed with different introductions without having the data. I don't think that's particularly fruitful, but I'm offering a guess that I think the breakdown of responses would be very, very different if we asked, would people be equally willing to defer to scientists to make decisions for them in areas that would actually make them drink less, drive more slowly, and really influence their way of life. And I think this one is a very, I'm guessing one that's heavily influenced by how people think about in that particular, what people think about when they answer the question. And my guess is this is a COVID type answer that is great in a hypothetical, but much less we'll have much less public buy-in in a concrete situation when it goes against our priors and values.
If I can add something to that, to what Dietrich was saying, what I find interesting about this type of questions, and even us talking about science or talking about scientists, is that what does the public have in mind when we say scientists? Which scientists are they thinking about? Are they thinking, you know, like it could be like, you know, like other type of, like in the context of COVID, I mean, there's a plethora of scientific disciplines that were involved in providing data. So I feel like, you know, we keep on talking about science as science exists in a pedestal with a big S versus, you know, there are sciences and scientists, very different scientists. We are scientists here in this room, right? And so on. So I think going back to that very interesting survey, it would be interesting to follow with interviews to really find out what mental model people have in mind when they think about these issues.
Okay, there is another question. That's Birte Fenrich. To Dieter Schäufele, thanks for the talk. Following your idea of overselling science, I would argue that the overall scientism that we observe in politics, society, and maybe even in science itself is as problematic as science skepticism and denial is. That's a thesis, huh?
Yeah, I would plus one that strongly is, and I think COVID was a really good example for the risks and a really good illustration of the risks that can come out of that. But I think well beyond COVID, I mentioned this in a half sentence earlier, you know, issues like AI, the key questions that will, or KI in Germany, the questions that are going to be raised by these technologies are going to be about societal applications, about equity, about access, all about things that science cannot answer. CRISPR is not dissimilar, where we've actually gotten really good at answering questions about the technical risks and benefits, off-target effects and other things. But we've been really not so good at and that's putting it mildly, at answering the broader societal questions that, again, we can't answer with scientific data, but that are much more important for moving forward with these technologies. And that's not going to change as we're pushing AI, as we're pushing CRISPR, as we're pushing a lot of these more post-normal types of technologies, where that kind of thinking is at best not applicable and at worst dysfunctional. So I totally agree.
Okay, well, let me challenge this a little bit. On the one hand, we can sort of think in terms of a continuum. On the one hand, there's, as Berta just said, there's, so to speak, an overzealous scientism, i.e. the belief in the veracity of anything that comes out of science or sciences, as Dominique just said. On the other side is a world of misinformation, of conspiracy theory, i.e., if I make it short, saying irrationality. I call it irrationality. So we've been thinking about, for instance, in the realm of scientific advice to policymaking for many, many, many years now. What is, so to speak, the ideal or the justified combination? How should, and Dietrich said in his talk that a belief in so to speak, in science is not a good guidance for policymaking. Actually, it can be undemocratic. Recent paper by or little book by Arthur Bogner talks about the epistemocracy or epistocracy. That used to be technocracy. Okay, so that's the continuum. Now here comes science communication. We can sort of discard science communication that is actually science PR. I think, I don't know of anybody anymore who would support that outright. In some cases, it's not distinguished clearly, but the support of science communication as being PR is out the door. However, given the fact that we now know of the mechanisms that social psychology has revealed to us, i.e. motivated reasoning, et cetera, et cetera. Wouldn't we have to say that science communication that has the motive to correct or to convince of the rationality of scientific epistemology is actually hopeless? In other words, we might as well forget it and accept the fact that about a third or a quarter of the population does not believe in science, does not believe in scientific rationality or in the value of scientific epistemology. Or put otherwise, how high would you rate the percentage in the population, in a democratic population, that are conspiracy theory addicts, fake believers, etc.? And to sort of turn it around once more, would you accept when you correctly make the point that science, of course, does not have the ultimate truth either, but does it follow that we discard scientific rationality, so to speak, as an orienting value? That's actually two questions in one.
Well, I can start, and I would argue, provocatively, I would say, Peter, that I like to do that. Number one, scientific rationality, and from a sociology of science perspective, we could argue that what does he mean really? We know that scientific knowledge is constructed, and, depending, scientists are human beings. And I know that even in the comments we were reading, scientific experts being in public talking about things that do not relate to their expertise, that overclaim and simplify science, not because they want to do a PR thing, but maybe because they actually fail to realize that actually knowing the social psychology and risk perception is actually useful, that the way you actually frame, your argument, the way you present the science will have important consequences in people who are perceiving. So I would argue that actually, like, those who want to do science communication should understand the processes, and it doesn't mean that they should not correct what potentially is misconstrued, but understand why people perceive those facts to be correct. So that's my first thing. My second thing I would argue that I would challenge the assumption that people do not believe in science, people, all those things that we say about the pathological publics, that there's a problem with them and we are the right one. There's a problem with them and science knows. Because at the end of the day, like Science Communication 101 or Communication 101, if communication fails, it's because the communicator didn't make an effort to understand the audience, to understand where they're coming from, and so on. So it's not us versus them. It's like an issue, a problem, climate change, COVID, and so on, where we all embedded together, where there's different dimensions that should be tackled, like in conjunction. So I do believe interdisciplinarity. I think that, maybe we shouldn't have communication about COVID-19 without social sciences at the table. That was a mistake. That's why we had all the mess that we had. And we can build on each other's strength about all scientific discipline to tackle a problem. Because at the end of the day, it's not that people do not believe in science. They're just going to believe the science that supports their belief. We think that that science is not the good one. We think it's not the one that's rational and so on. So the question is more about people not understanding the process maybe, and then goes back to how do we teach science? How do we teach the nature of science and so on? So it goes back to that idea of facts versus something else. And that I think we need to really carefully think about. And that's why I thought that thinking it from a risk perception was kind of useful. I see Mike is nodding, so.
Okay, we have several questions lined up here. And Glenn first. You have to turn on your mic. Yeah, okay.
I think Mike and Ortwin was before me, so.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Go ahead, yes.
Okay. Actually, my question was already asked by yourself in it, but I just want to follow up a little bit. So what is there for us now as journalists, where fact-checking is no longer, important, where the truth and that sort of thing is not important anymore? Where are we heading to? Is it the failure of rationality, and what is the job of science journalists these days if we are not going to, if the sort of thing that we are doing every day, like fact-checking and bringing truth and all those things to people, doesn't work anymore. So that's a question for, because it's very, what you were talking about was charmed very well with the research about data and statistics communication, where data, the numbers do not really get people engaged unless you get the emotion in. You get the emotion and the belief, some way to address that. But so what's our job as journalists now and in the future?
Okay, to whom do you address the question?
To Dominic and both.
Dominic, okay.
You raise a great point about numbers and processing numbers and so on. And it's interesting because I've been, talking to a number of journalists about that. And so number one, I think that as Dietmar answered in the question and answer, we do need to have training in statistics and so on for our journalism, students. It is very important, particularly related to science. But number two, if you go back to risk perceptions and the magnitude of, a potential, hazard consequence is more important than the perceived magnitude than the real, risk. In other words, people pay attention to qualitative factors more than quantitative factors when realizing what's important to them. In short, as Dietmar was saying, if I perceive people around me to be safe and not sick of COVID, I can tell people as much as I want that there is close to 800,000 people died in the United States out of COVID. They still would discard that information because it's not relevant to them. People around them are not dying, right? So the point is, if I want to communicate numbers related to that, I would use metaphors that people can relate to. We big in American football in the United States. We have, the big football stadium very close by from my local football team can hold 80,000 people. So I tell them, what may be more useful is to say, imagine somebody goes to a football game. This Sunday, there's one, at the end of the football, 80 people would be dead. 80 of these people that that are watching, and then suddenly people can connect the football, connect whatever. So I think it's important for us to understand how people process numbers, to put them in a context that's relevant and they can connect the dots. So journalists obviously have a really big job to do and a lot of responsibility to do that.
Can I just reframe a question, just to correct my question a little? Okay. All right. We are talking about science and data and all those things. Not doing a great job, whether you are, reporting very good science or good data or good statistics. It doesn't change mind. It doesn't alter the way people, think, or because it's just against the belief. So what's our job? How are we heading? Where are we heading in? If we face this world where Trump supporters wouldn't listen to anything that against them, whether it is science, whether it's data, or whether it is anything that rational evidence, all those things. So, what is the job of us as journalists and also as science communicators?
All right, so that's a great point, but I think the job is to bring to the conversation the people that the readers will listen to. So journalists have a choice in who they cite, who they bring as sources, how the information is framed. Look, right now in the United States, we have a problem with polarization. It's all about Republicans, Democrats, and more. I think the media have a crucial responsibility to not amplify this. We have a study right now to say Trump counties that voted for Trump are dying more of COVID than other counties. Why report it that way? Why not say close to 70% of Americans are fully vaccinated? This is the norm. Counties, large counties are more, safer than others, which is true, by the way. So it depends how you report information. So I think going back to Dietrich's point, it's not that we shouldn't report on the science. You should be careful about how we frame it. It's like, it's the way we relay this information. It doesn't mean that actually we should avoid doing it, but we should carefully think about, as science communicators, how we do it.
Okay. Let me just interject and say that that, of course, would require that the media are changing their logic, their operating logic, and no longer follow the usual news values. That because as Dietrich also pointed out, the constant reporting of Trump is giving him free advertisement. Yeah. Mike Schaefer, next.
Yes, thank you very much, Dominique and Dietrich.
But Mike, could you move closer to the mic? There's a lot of sort of echo there in your room.
New building, it sounds like a cave. I'm sorry. Yeah. Thanks, Dietrich. Thanks, Dominique, for problematizing some of the seemingly simple solutions that we have about fact-checking, debunking, etc., and also for adding the long view about winning the war in the long run and staying credible arbiters of truth. My question is related to one of your first bullets, Dietrich. While I shared the others, this one I would need some convincing or maybe some explaining, which was that you said that the link of misinformation to behavior is limited at best. We do, if I understood correctly, we do have at least correlational evidence. We have quite a lot. That in certain groups, we have certain kinds of behaviors or the being adverse to certain kinds of behaviors that correlate at least with being exposed to certain kinds of information, to using certain channels, to being present on certain platforms, messengers, etc., etc. And now you can say, well, of course, there's a third variable explaining all that belonging to a certain community or a certain identity, quote unquote, tribe or something. But I would like some explanation, please.
Dicham, you want to answer?
Yeah, and you already, like a good debater, kind of addressed the first argument I'm going to make, which is for a lot of these groups, I will first contradict you a little bit and then agree with you actually. Where for those groups, a lot of the behaviors that they engage or don't engage in are tribal in nature, meaning they are driven by what and who people are surrounded by, rather than, and that drives their informational diets and the information that they endorse as true. I think Jamie Druckmann has written a really good piece where he also said a lot of the motivated reasoning stuff is actually weirdly a search for truth, meaning if I'm a conservative and Donald Trump is president, it's not an unreasonable assumption that what my president tells me is actually true. That should be a reasonable assumption to make. And so, or turning to Fox News, same thing is true, of course, in Germany, for instance, where a lot of people are convinced that there's solid scientific evidence that genetically modified crops are not safe for human consumption. That just contradicts every piece of scientific evidence that's out there. But of course, and there are lots of other arguments to be made against GMOs, but it really is about a particular adherence to a particular viewpoint. So I do think it's more complicated than that, but this is where I will agree with you. We're writing a piece that hopefully will be out soon in the Annals of Political Science for a special issue that Jamie Druckman, to mention him one more time, is editing, where we're actually making an argument that there are different ways of judging truth claims that will make interventions more or less urgent, and that there's actually a good bit of variability of how strong the behavior information link is across different issues, right? So where, let's say the flat earther, it's not that important because the behavior that it may change is not relevant. Societally, the societal or individual risk is somewhat limited. For others, especially when it comes to health behaviors, the link may be much stronger. We also added other criteria that I think matter in addition to the behavioral link. The likelihood of that getting algorithmic traction in a modern news environment, and so on and so forth. So I think actually I agree with you overall that that to present that bullet as a static, well, that holds across issues is just not true. For some of them, there are stronger behavioral outcomes and ones that are more societally or individually adverse than for others. So and hopefully we'll explain that in more detail. I'd be happy to share the preprint on that one, but yes, I totally agree.
Okay, Artvin.
Well, thank you very much also for this kind of provocative talks that you just made. I wanted just to challenge a little bit the kind of implications of what you're saying. I mean, I'm also, very clear that there is all these confirmation biases and everything else. I mean, that we are all very much aware of. But what is the role of science communication then? And I think that's something where I believe we should be probably a little bit clearer about the kind of role of what, information communication should actually address. And that's, of course, a normative question. But for example, if you think about there is information out there that's absurd, that there is absolutely no way that there's no evidence for anything that claims. I mean, in the 1950s, people claimed that smoking would make you healthier. Now, and that was carried on until the late 60s, even the early 70s. Now, if you take that example, should scientists say, well, it's up to your decision to smoke or not to smoke, well, we don't have any evidence? That is probably not sufficient, or even to say, if you believe that smoking is good for you, just go on. That would be worse. And I think, what science communication, I mean, if it takes its role seriously, is to say, well, there is, something which is absurd, and there's something that's possible, but it's not very likely. There's something that's fairly likely, and there's something that's almost certain. And I think we can, distinguish between those different camps quite well. And of course, as we know, all knowledge is going on and carries on, and specifically all kind of probability information that we have is always ambivalent and ambiguous. But nevertheless, there are things that are purely wrong. And let's take even a more stronger example. And if we have Germany, a strong group in the internet that says the Jewish conspiration is responsible for the coronavirus. Now, should we say, oh, well, that's your belief, we should accept this because they have whatever bad experience with Jewish people or not, or think they have? Or should, as science communicators, we could say, well, that's not acceptable and we should do something about it? So my question really to you is, where is the responsibility of scientists as communicators or science communicators in order to convey things like truth? And that's, I think it's not a trivial question, but given all the uncertainties, given all the ambiguities, given all the facts that also truth about perception is truth, that's the social facts that we're dealing with. Nevertheless, I mean, isn't there something like, an enlightenment mandate for science?
Okay, I just want to, before you answer, Dieter, since Dominique has to leave in about 5 minutes, I can sort of follow up on Audrey's question and address it to her and say, all the behaviors of scientists, or the questions that we have of scientists' behaviors we might have, all that is actually not necessarily what science is about. In other words, yes, of course, scientists are as fallible and as human and with all the bad properties that people have. That's not the same as saying that science as an institution, i.e. as a set of epistemological rules, et cetera, that is the actual orienting value that we're talking about, which cannot, I mean, we could replace it, but as Ortwin just said, if you do that, you know, we're probably having some real serious value problems. But anyway, go ahead.
I guess I was a bad communicator because I never claimed that we should just leave it as this be and not communicate anything. So what I argue is that, you know, like in the context of the pandemic, and we should be careful that we are talking about now taking a normative approach to science communication in general versus what happened in the pandemic. And I think there's a lesson learned from the pandemic. For the pandemic, when science was very uncertain, we had science as an institution, mainly not some scientists, but you know, that tend to portray science as more certain than it was. And Ortwin, I really agree with you. What they should have said is, based on the evidence right now, knowing what we know right now, this is the best approach, science advice, knowing that it's a policy decision, letting people stay home, not go to work, losing their job, having mental health issues, policy decision. Science gives based on the best science evidence. That's what we advise. That's the only thing I said. I think there's two things that we need to take into account, going back to Anne's point though, that you cannot disconnect science and institution from other institutions in society. And this is, you know, the media, the academic institute and so on. And even if, you know, scientists portray the scientific finding, you know, with the whole, you know, ambiguity that you just mentioned, the media tend to portray science as more certain than it is, you know, like, and claiming studies to be like, so there's a role for feedback too, for scientists to say, wait a minute, this is just based on the evidence, we may know more and so on. I just think that we need to realize that things are more complicated than just communicating fact and truth. And that some truths, I mean, I think nobody would argue that gravity is a bunch of nonsense. And if I just let the apple go down, it's still going to go down. In terms of pandemic, though, it's extremely important to be careful and not portray certainty where there isn't, because then it goes back and destroys trust, and that's not what we want. And indeed, actually, I'm going to go to an executive committee for that National Academy of Science network I was telling you, where we're going to address exactly those questions, like at 12. Well, like, how can we portray science in a way that actually stays trusted, but like also making sure that we don't overpromise? Because if we overpromise, it's going to end up actually hurting us all.
Dominique, you're the first to leave. Thanks for participating. We'll be in touch. And yeah, it was good to see you again.
Yeah, thank you so much. A very interesting discussion. And let's stay in touch. Bye-bye now. Bye, Mike.
Okay. Dietram, you have to respond to Ortwin's intervention.
No, I'll just plus one what Dominique has said, which is along the same lines, and add a couple of things that, I mean, I have an appreciation for, you know, the relitigating enlightenment, which is sometimes what it feels like we're doing and have been doing during the Trump years, and capital E enlightenment. And so, but I think part of the tricky part with that is, meaning that we lose cultural authority of science, is precisely because we overstep. And I appreciated the smoking example because kind of it overlaps really nicely between, well, smoking is bad for you and you shouldn't smoke, are really two separate statements, right? One of them is a scientific statement, the other one is a normative statement, especially once we're putting that into rules and regulations. And I think this is where scientists very often, we have a problem. So I'll give you one example, a sentence that says, we should mandate childhood vaccinations for kitas, for kindergartens, whatever, because we shouldn't rather mandate those because vaccines cause autism. Our instinct is, well, that's completely wrong. And half of that sentence is wrong. Vaccines don't cause autism, but that doesn't mean we should mandate vaccines in childcare facilities. That's a democratic question. And the moment we speak to that first one as if it with scientific authority and saying our technical evidence can answer this political question, we are actually going to create little cracks in enlightenment, because we're basically seeing as a partisan player, not as the best curator of knowledge and information in society, which is exactly where post-enlightened thinking, I think, hopefully, or enlightened thinking and everything that it's developed toward since then comes in. Second, and I think this is where, maybe echoing what Dominique said, but a really good example of how correcting absurd facts without thinking about how much social damage or not damage they may be doing is a really good example for that is Donald Trump's statement about injecting bleach. He made a throwaway comment at a press conference where he tried to describe what he recalled from a briefing beforehand about how we could combat the virus, and it turned into sequences of half sentences that made no sense. No question about this. Nobody would have ever paid any attention to any of this had it not been every liberal commentator, every science journalist jumped on this and basically turned this into a gigantic story about Donald Trump said we should be injecting bleach, which then led a bunch of people to do really stupid stuff. The point being, we basically took something that would have never made it out of the Oval Office into anybody's home by fact-checking, error-correcting, ridiculing, and turned it into something now that is in the vernacular of every single person in the world, not every single person in the world, but certainly in the US, that Donald Trump said, inject bleach. And so sometimes that you know, the more grotesque it gets, sometimes there's probably a line like, let's just let it go and it'll disappear in the ether of the internet and never to reappear again. So that's the only thing that I would add to what Dominique said.
But here we are actually at a point which may be worth discussing for a little bit, and that is the attention orientation of science. In other words, the competition for attention. The competition for attention has not only been raised by social media, but certainly they have played a major role. That now scientists are sort of vying for attention of the general public. Ironically, or maybe paradoxically, science communication, which is being pushed by governments all over the world now, is actually doing exactly what you are criticizing, namely communicating science to the general public no matter what. In other words, and it's probably not possible to sort of turn the clock back, but it requires from science, from scientific institutions primarily, it requires a completely new ethics or attitude, how they communicate to the public. The one part of it is PR now being done by universities, academies all over the world. But that's just one problem. But the general problem is exactly what you described, namely that these kinds of messages are being picked up by media of all kinds. And the scientists, unfortunately, play a big role in that.
I mean, I think there's a host of factors that have contributed to, or that continue to contribute to a rapidly changing landscape in how information is exchanged. And not to take away from your argument that, you know, there's been more of a public orientation among universities and so on and so forth. I continue to see the line between science PR and other areas of science communication as much more fluid than most people in Germany do. I think when we write a DFG grant or an NSF grant, we're engaging in heavy PR, right? When we're all tweeting, we're engaging in heavy PR. And you know, that has been like this in the 90s and in the 80s, and that will continue to happen. So I actually do think that line is a very fluid one, or not as clear cut. But number two is, I think, what's a much bigger challenge, and this is one that will be harder to tackle, is that we're going into an information environment that's still rapidly changing, that prioritizes engagement over truth, meaning the incentive system for large social media platforms and legacy media, this includes the Washington Post, this includes the New York Times, that A/B test their headlines, that A/B test their leads to make sure that the stories that they put out get the most engagement on social, get the widest reach on social. All of those things, this is where the profit margins are going. And the idea of old subscription models are increasingly going away. And there's some countries like Germany that are protected from that a little bit more because of a public television system. But even there, a printing press that relies on some of the same dynamics will get sucked more and more into these dynamics. And of course, all of us, when we express our outrage on Twitter about the latest study or not study, this is why I showed that Cornell study about Trump. This study was spread by scientists all over the world because it confirmed what we already believe, meaning that Trump was an idiot and he was responsible for all misinformation. That study was a horrible piece of social science research. If it had shown the opposite, we would have shredded it to pieces. But we didn't, because it confirmed our biases. So scientists do the exact same thing in these environments, absolutely. But I think that structural factor is a much more difficult one, because we basically, to the earlier point about science journalism, what used to be a set of translators that were able, and this, I still don't think their job was ever to fact check. Their job was to meaningfully connect science to mental frameworks that people had and show them why it mattered. And that's just simply gone. And so I think we're seeing too many wheels, or too many tectonic changes at the same time to really make predictions about what's coming next. But for me, the biggest one is algorithmic news delivery. That's one that we're going into with our eyes open. We're beginning to see some data, some of it collected by people on this panel, that helps us guide our thinking a little bit, but we're woefully underprepared for that. And the idea that we as scientists communicate with the public without any of these other factors in there, there's no direct line that we have. Everything that we're putting out is going to be immediately repurposed, recurated, and competing with lots of other messages in an environment that's just fundamentally changed from even where it was 5 years ago. So I put less blame on science PR and much more on factors that are just economic changes in the media system.
Okay, thank you very much. I see that several people have to leave us. We could continue this discussion, I think, for quite some time. With this, I think we should close, except if someone raises the hand and says, no, I don't, I want to continue by all circumstances. I want to thank you very, very much for participating, for taking the trouble. As a matter of fact, this workshop could not have taken place without the technology of Zoom. Since we could not have you travel here, and if the pandemic would have made it impossible. And after all, I would like to think that this kind of conversation will go on, and especially the COVID-centered communication I've done together with Francois, who unfortunately can't make it. I've done a study myself about the first reactions and the interaction with policymakers, trust and legitimacy of their decisions, etc., which hopefully will be published soon. And I think this is the pandemic is sort of a quasi social experiment that we have experienced and are still experiencing, which highlights the relationship between science, politics, and the general public. Anyway, so yeah, I bid you farewell. I hope we will be in touch on these topics. If you care to sort of come back to this issue, you can always check the Mediathek of the Academy, where this has been recorded, and we'll provide you with any other information. The working group will also publish its final report in January. Of course, many of you are members now of the group. So anyway, goodbye, good evening, and see you sometime.